In this screencast, you will be introduced to cellular metabolism. You can find information on cellular metabolism in Chapter 24 of your textbook. This is what you should learn from the screencast. First, define blood sugar and identify its sources. Compare the oxidation of glucose to the oxidation of a fossil fuel, such as methane. List the three major metabolic pathways of glucose catabolism. We have discussed all the different functions of the organelles that are found within cells. Recall that cells are protein factories, and much of what a cell does is related to protein. Cells produce protein, they modify those proteins, they move those proteins within the cell, they'll export those proteins out of the cell, they'll install those proteins in the plasma membrane, etc. Well, all this movement requires energy in the form of ATP. So all these organelles that are doing various things require ATP. We will now look at how cells generate ATP. If you recall, carbohydrates are used almost exclusively as a source of energy by the body. Very little carbohydrate is actually incorporated into our cells and tissues. There's a little bit attached to proteins and attached to lipids to form glycoproteins and glycolipids respectively, but most of the carbohydrate that you consume, it will be used as a source of energy. Carbohydrates that are consumed, digested, and absorbed into the blood are eventually converted to glucose, or what is commonly referred to as blood sugar. That glucose is then transported to cells throughout the body. The cells take up that glucose and then oxidize it to release energy. When we say oxidize, some oxidizing agent pulls electrons away from the atoms of glucose and energy is released. And that energy is eventually going to be incorporated into ATP that can then be used by the cell. Let's look now at the overall reaction for the oxidation of glucose. So here's the equation representing the oxidation of glucose. C6H12O6 is glucose, and then here we have 6 molecules of oxygen. Yields 6 molecules of carbon dioxide and water, and energy is going to be released in the oxidation of glucose. Let's look now at how similar this is to the burning of a fossil fuel, like methane. So methane is a natural gas. It's used in stoves, in hot water heaters, etc. Here we have methane, CH4. It's burned or oxidized in the presence of oxygen to yield carbon dioxide and water, and heat is and energy is given off in the process. So if you look, the burning of a fossil fuel is not really different than the oxidation of glucose. It's why when something ignites or something burns, you have to have oxygen. And as you know, carbon dioxide is produced. And from your own experience, you know you have to have oxygen at all times. Why? It's required to oxidize glucose and other molecules. And also this equation reveals why you produce carbon dioxide, and which must be removed by your lungs and exhaled. So the oxidation of glucose in the human body is not really much different than the oxidation of methane or other natural gases. I'm going to give a little nuance to what I just said. The overall process of the oxidation of glucose and the oxidation of a fossil fuel like methane is the same in terms of what you start with and what you end with, right? You start with a fuel and oxygen, you end with carbon dioxide and water, and energy is released. However, how you get from reactants to products is very different. If glucose were oxidized in one step, like methane is burned in one step, that sudden intense burst of energy would destroy the cell, tissues, organs, and you'd spontaneously combust, right? If glucose was oxidized like methane, you'd just go and spontaneously combust. And obviously that doesn't happen. The oxidation of glucose is carried out in a series of small steps, releasing a little energy with each step. Each step is controlled separately by enzymes, and energy is therefore released in small amounts. And as that energy is released, it's captured in the formation of ATP. Some of that energy that is not captured in the form of ATP, and it's a lot actually, is released as heat and used to heat the body, and most of it is eventually lost from the body. Recall that in an oxidation reduction reaction, electrons are transferred from one atom or molecule to another. And if we want to follow the electrons, we follow hydrogen, because hydrogen's carrying those electrons. So here we have methane and we have oxygen. And oxygen is basically going to remove those electrons from methane to form water. Remember, we follow the hydrogen. So the hydrogens are going to pull those electrons from carbon, give them the oxygen, and form water. And as those electrons are pulled away from methane, energy is going to be released. And we see and feel that energy in the form of heat and light. A similar process is happening in the oxidation of glucose in the cells of the body in the mitochondrion. However, the process of transferring electrons from methane to oxygen to form water happens in little incremental steps. And with each little step, a little energy is released and a little heat is released as well. With every little step, a little energy is released, some of which is incorporated into ATP, some is lost as heat. Another little step, and so we get from here to here over a process of many little steps, where with each little step or reaction, some energy is released and captured in ATP, and some energy is released as heat. So you can sort of think of the oxidation of glucose in the body as like a controlled burn, similar to the oxidation of methane, but it occurs through many tiny little steps, each one releasing a little energy that's incorporated in ATP and a little heat to maintain body temperature. Before moving on, I do want to mention that triglycerides and amino acids are also oxidized to release energy that is captured in ATP in a similar manner to glucose. This process is not exclusive to glucose. However, traditionally, the oxidation of glucose is what is used to explain the overall process. And so we're going to study the oxidation or catabolism of glucose just to understand how fuels from ingested food is used to generate ATP. But I want you to understand that this process is not exclusive to glucose. Triglycerides from the fats and oils we ingest, as well as amino acids from the proteins that we consume, digest, and absorb into our blood, are oxidized in a similar manner. I'm now going to outline the three major metabolic pathways that are involved in the complete oxidation and catabolism of glucose. The first is glycolysis. Glucose is a 6-carbon compound, and during glycolysis, it's going to be split into 2 3-carbon compounds of pyruvic acid. And this occurs in the cytoplasm. During the process of anaerobic fermentation, that pyruvic acid is going to be temporarily reduced to a molecule called lactic acid. This occurs in the cytoplasm and does not require oxygen. Aerobic respiration occurs in the mitochondrion, and what's going to happen, we're going to take that pyruvic acid from the cytoplasm, we're going to move it into the mitochondrion, and it's going to be completely oxidized to carbon dioxide and water. In the upcoming screencasts, we will look at these 3 pathways in detail: glycolysis, anaerobic fermentation, and aerobic respiration. Before ending the screencast, let's review the learning objectives. Define blood sugar and identify its sources. Compare the oxidation of glucose to the oxidation of a fossil fuel such as methane. And number 3, list the 3 major metabolic pathways of glucose catabolism.